Hi, welcome to another special edition of the Mr. Nowak's Classroom Virtually Irrelevant podcast. We're doing something a little differently today. HHS 4U student Meagan Beattie is here. She's going to discuss parent-child relationships. This is her assessment of learning for Unit 4 in the course. So we're going to have a discussion about some of the trends, some of the theories about parent-child relationships, and it's something new, so we're going to try it. So Meagan, welcome. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm okay. You had a busy weekend.
I did have a busy weekend.
Tell us more.
My sister got married on Saturday, which was very exciting. I'm very happy for her and her new husband, Joe. It was a beautiful wedding. We had the weather we wanted. It rained only just a tiny bit, and everyone looked great. It was a lot of fun.
That's good. That's good. Now, of course, if you don't make the connection between Meagan and her father is Craig Beattie, teacher at Opeongo currently and former assistant basketball coach here at RCI. So that's the connection here. So we're going to start off talking about some of the definitions or some of the trending terms in parenting right now. Meagan, can you tell us about real virtuality? What does that mean in terms of child-parent relationships?
Well, real virtuality is when media is used in terms of child development, and a child is stimulated through various images which become their most insistent reality. This will affect the way a child learns, how well they learn, and the means through which they best learn, both in school and at home. An example of this would be a child who spends a lot of time being stimulated through television or through music being a part of their daily life, and then this child may have difficulty in situations where they don't receive this same level of stimulation, such as in the classroom or reading a book.
That was very well said, and I think so. We're seeing now with iPads and we're using iPads and that kind of technology to help teach kids. That's having an impact on teachers' jobs and parenting jobs later. Can kids really focus without the stimulation of these images and these bells and whistles, if you will? What about a cumulative advantage?
A cumulative advantage is when you have something that's a small difference initially, but it ends up kind of snowballing and it makes a bigger difference at the end. An example of this would be a parent or a teacher giving a child a small opportunity when they're younger. Maybe it's letting them play a sport, maybe it's dance, maybe it's helping them with a part of their education that they realize they really have connected with this particular individual, or maybe this opportunity is something they want to pursue later in life that ends up becoming a huge part of who they are as they develop.
This was a term that was coined or talked about in Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, and he talked about the cumulative advantage of being born in the first 3 months of the year. So if you were born January, February, March, you are going to have a certain advantage when you start kindergarten over your peers. You've had, whatever number of months ahead of someone who's born in September, October, so you've had that much more experience in reading and communicating. So sometimes professionals will say, oh, you're well advanced. We're going to put you in the special reading group. Physically, those are born at the first of the year might have developed more, may have better coordination, are bigger. So they're the ones who are going to make the sports teams early on and then get the better coaching and then are likely to make those teams later on. It's a very interesting theory, and some math teachers, including our very own Mr. Ugama, has looked at the rosters of various sports teams to see if this example holds true. Now, interesting enough, Meagan, I looked at the World Cup roster for our women's team, and that theory didn't hold true there. So, but it'd be an interesting, very interesting discussion. Can you talk to us about the difference between concerted cultivation and the natural growth?
Concerted cultivation is the idea of a parent or another individual having a real interest in fostering and assessing a child's skills and abilities. So this would be things like trying to make sure that your baby's learning Their words early on, this could be, I know personally, Baby Einstein was one that was used on my little brother. It was trying to get him to just have brain stimulation early on to help him later on in school. Natural growth was the other one.
Accomplishment of natural growth,
Accomplishment of natural growth. Accomplishment of natural growth is more the idea that a child will develop naturally on their own, and you don't need as much of that active stimulation. You don't need to be giving them more stimulation because they will stimulate themselves enough to accomplish their growth in a natural way. That's what it's called.
So if you were to relate this to your personal experience, what approach do you think your parents took? Was it concerted cultivation, or was it accomplishment of natural growth? Did they push you or kind of let you do your own thing?
I think it would be a mixture of both. I have 3 biological siblings, so it would be different also between the oldest and the youngest. You have more time, obviously, with the oldest kids, which is me and my brother, than you do with the younger kids when you already have a whole bunch of other ones. So I think for my brother and I, it was very much taking us out to the park, trying to teach us new things that way. It was asking us these different questions when we were little. With my younger siblings, I think it would be, there's still a lot of that, but I think it would be more them just interacting with the family in a natural way, and that's going to bring them into development. Because there are so many more people who have developed more than they have, it's that sense of their exposure to that is going to help bring them along, as opposed to someone actively trying to stimulate them. They're more stimulated naturally.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, let's talk about Canadian fertility. Back in the baby boom, we were averaging about 3.1 kids per woman. We're down to about 1.66, which is actually a jump in the last 5-10 years. Why do you think that's happening?
Well, increased knowledge about fertility and contraceptives, I think, is a big part of that. Also, we've seen an increase in movements of women's rights and education for all kinds of different groups, which I think has had an impact. Studies have shown that higher levels of education among women means that they have a desire to have less kids. Also, we're deciding to have kids later in life as a result of this. Women are often wanting to start a career and get established in the workplace before they want to start a family. Oftentimes, this means that you'll be having kids later on in life. Instead of starting to have children maybe when you're 23, 24, maybe you're starting when you're 28, 29. At this point, with health risks being something to consider, you're not going to have as many kids because that might lead you into a time such as 39, 40, when it's not as safe necessarily to be having kids. There's risk of multiples and complications with the birth. And so this is something that we've seen different from the 50s, 60s, around the baby boom, when couples were having kids a lot younger and they were having a lot more.
So like Meagan mentioned, the average age of first-time mothers in Canada is up to 29.3. And as reproductive technologies improve, I wonder how much of a risk it is to have children at a later age. It used to be the cutoff was 40, but the studies that I've read, and I'm not a thorough reader of parenting by any means, but it's not as much of a risk as we initially thought. Now, let's transition to the part of Canadian infertility, which is defined as a couple trying to conceive a child for 1 year. There are many theories about why our infertility rate is so high, 1 in 5. Why do you think it is high? And I think I answered it a little bit in your previous answer.
I think, like I said, people are waiting to have kids until later. I think a big part of it also has been stress in their lives. A lot of our society now is very fast-paced, it's very high demand, and I think that potentially for individuals who are living stressful lives, whether that be their job or other circumstances, that can make it more difficult for them to have kids. Also, people are suggesting things like the chemicals that are in our food or in the water. I know one of the things was that there's estrogen levels in the water that we're not really sure if that's having an impact on fertility in couples. So there are a lot of different things that people are suggesting, environmental reasons why couples are more infertile than they were. Again, a lot of it could be that they're just waiting to have kids until that peak time for conception has passed.
And simply, maybe it's not as taboo not to have kids anymore. What are some of the, Fran Baum came up with some reasons why women, and I guess it could apply to men too, don't have children. Could you summarize what he was saying?
Well, he suggested, I believe, 4 reasons why women might decide not to have kids. The first reason is called hedonistic reasons. This is just when a woman decides that she can spend her time, her money, her energy, kind of however she wants. And where a lot of women decide to spend it on children and on a family, some women decide, maybe I'd like to spend this on traveling. Maybe I'd like to spend this on me, on my husband, on anything else that they would choose to invest a lot of time and money into that would mean that kids for them just wasn't the choice they wanted to make. They'd choose to spend their money other ways. A second reason is idealistic reasons. This is when you're concerned with the way the world is and you just wouldn't feel at peace about bringing a child into a world where there's so many problems. You know, things like maybe ISIS, things like smallpox or measles, like these sorts of diseases that we're seeing come back in. Maybe it's just you live in a community where it's not very safe. You don't want to be bringing a child into that kind of world. You don't think that's fair to that potential child. Another reason would be emotional reasons. Some women just don't have that emotional draw to children. They don't feel like having children is something that they've ever really wanted, and so the choice for them to have a child is more just, it's an easy thing. They haven't really thought about it as much, maybe. And the final reason is practical reasons. Maybe this is where the couple has seen health problems in their family and they wouldn't want to pass that on to a baby and a child. There's other reasons, of course, too, that would be practical, but this is the one that really stood out to me from the examples that you have. There's health reasons that would make it difficult for that child when they were growing up and you didn't want to put the child through that. Of course, like Mr. Nowak said, this is all true also of males. However, since females are the ones who are actually carrying the baby, a lot of the decision would tend to rest on their shoulders as well, but of course it is a couple's decision.
Again, fantastic. That leads to, you know, Baum really talks about these are the reasons why women will voluntarily not have children. That can lead to involuntary childlessness, as you know, as you have mentioned already, that the longer you wait, it might be a little more difficult in your upper years to conceive a child. But now we have these artificial reproductive technologies with fertility clinics and just the technology to really reproduce a child. What are some of the questions or issues, both ethically and just, I guess, critically, about the use of artificial reproductive technologies?
Well, one of the first ones is about older parents, again, as we've been talking about. Sometimes, it's always difficult, I think, to be raising a very energetic, up at all hours infant, toddler. For a parent who is in maybe their 30s or 40s, they don't have the energy of a 20-year-old, and that might make parenting for them more difficult. So the first question we would ask would be, how is this going to affect older parents having younger kids? The second one would be multiple births. There can be a lot more complications when you're having multiple babies, which is something that increases A, with age, and B, with reproductive technologies. Hyperovulation is something that is caused by certain drugs that people use to help them conceive, and again, this can cause births of twins, triplets, in the case of John and Kate, even 6 babies at once. So this is something that we need to consider as well, the health of these babies and the health of their mothers in multiple births. Another question more ethically is, for these babies who are maybe born as a result of artificial insemination, or they have had a mother who has sort of lent her uterus, as they say, to help their parents have a baby, do they have a right to know who their parent is in that regard? And also, what is the definition of parenting, of parenthood, now that we are having these other individuals not interfere, but be involved in the conception process. So those are the last two questions. How is the definition of parenthood affected by this? And do children who have been conceived as a result of some of these artificial technologies, do they have a right to know about this, and do they have a right to know who their parent is?
And such a new idea, and the legalities around this are just so, it's just such a new idea. You can visit fertilitylaw.ca. There's actually fertility lawyers out of Toronto that you can explore this idea. And maybe a future career in law here for Miss Beattie here. Now, let's talk about the theory of parenting. And the course really simplifies it, saying there's 3 different styles: authoritarian, authoritative, and permissive. So I'm going to give you a scenario, and then I'm going to ask you how an authoritarian parent would deal with it, how authoritative, and how a permissive parent would deal with it. Okay, so let's say your 16-year-old child has broken curfew 3 times in a row without notifying you. Okay, I'm sure that's something you've never done.
No.
How would an authoritarian parenting style deal with this?
Well, authoritarian parent styles are typically maybe over-the-top strict, and they tend to have more rules and stronger discipline. So I would say that breaking curfew 3 times, well, for one, I'm surprised that would happen in an authoritarian parent situation, because typically after the first offense, an authoritarian parent, maybe after the second offense, would really crack down and say, okay, maybe your curfew is way earlier now, maybe you're not allowed to go out at all. Or they would take away privileges in another area, take away your cell phone, take away your ability to go out and see friends, cut off your allowance if that's something that they've been giving you. That's the sort of way an authoritarian parent would react. It's very discipline related, very much consequences will be enacted if you step outside the law.
What about authoritative?
Authoritative is less disciplinarian than an authoritarian parent. However, they do still abide by a set of rules. They tend to be more lenient and more concerned about the child's ability to make their own decisions. I think an authoritative parent, in this case, there might be some communication involved between the parent and the child, asking them if they realize what they did was wrong, and asking maybe the child what they think should be the consequence in this case, because the authoritative parent does believe that there should be consequences enacted for this kind of behavior, but they do think that the consequences should be fair, and I think they would give the child a chance to speak their part. Maybe if they had a really good reason that they were out so late, that would help the parent come to that conclusion in a way that's more fair for the child.
And finally, permissive.
Permissive, there's kind of 2 styles of permissive. There is the really overly emotionally involved in their child sort of permissive, which is when you just can't bear to discipline your child because you don't want to hurt them, you just love them too much. And so this style of permissive, I think, would just, maybe they wouldn't even say anything to the child at all, they would just let the behavior continue. And maybe they would say something like, oh, I didn't like that you were out so late last night, but they'd really just leave it at that because they don't want to punish their child because they're worried that that's going to hurt the relationship or hurt the child's psychological development. The other style of permissive is a permissive parent who just doesn't care about their child, and this sort of parent, again, wouldn't probably approach the subject at all. They would just, oh, you were out late last night, I don't really care. They wouldn't even consider punishing their child because it's not something that really bothers them at all.
So what do you think is the most effective way? Is it a hybrid, or what do you see as the best method?
I think it depends on the child. I think some children are more outgoing than others. Some children are, I don't want to say easier and more difficult to raise, but I think if you talk to a parent, they might use those words. There's 4 of us, so my parents have said that some of us have been easier to deal with than others.
I can't imagine.
Yeah, no. So I think it depends on the child's natural behavior. I know, again, my younger brother was a lot more difficult to sort of teach what was right and what was wrong. So my parents had to be a lot more strict in that case. However, I, being an angel child,
of course, yes, a model child, always on time.
I just had to be told once, and I would recover from whatever my infraction interaction with.
Of course.
So, but I would think that authoritative would be the place to start. Start there, and if your child needs more discipline, or even if they're especially good at making their own decisions, you can go either way from there. But I think that's the place where you'd want to start to ensure the best for your child.
Yeah, and I would agree, and I don't like to allude to Dawson's Creek often, but when I do, I talk about Sheriff Doug, and he says that a good parent has the ability to allow your child to fall or to fail, but is also there to pick them back up. And I don't know, that's something that kind of holds true towards me. Let's talk about the theoretical frameworks. These are kind of the 7, and we're not going to talk about all 7, but the theories that we use throughout the course. And we're going to talk about the decision to have a child. How would a conflict theorist approach the decision to have a child?
Well, for conflict theorists, the main concern for them is class issues and the issues between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, kind of who has money and who doesn't have money, and how is that influencing their ability to make these decisions. So for a conflict theorist, they're going to look at the richer families, and they're going to say, well, for them, the decision is purely based on whether they want a child or not. They don't have to worry about how expensive children are. They're not going to worry about having their child not have the best upbringing because they couldn't afford all the nice things for them. They're not going to have to worry about, health concerns because they can just pay for all that stuff. Whereas a couple who is maybe more struggling financially, they're going to have to make those decisions based on all of those things. They're going to have to consider, well, do we have money to put this child through maybe post-secondary education if they want that? If there's hospital bills that we're going to have to pay, particularly in the States, is this something that we're going to struggle with? Are we going to be around, or are we going to be working too much to really put emotional time into this kid? So I think in that case, the conflict theorist is thinking, well, clearly this is another occasion in which it's easier to be rich, because you can make this decision because you want to, whereas a poor couple might want to have a kid but decide not to for practical reasons.
And what about the feminist theory?
Well, I think a feminist theorist would say that the decision to have a child should be a woman's decision, because she's going to be the one who actually bears the child for 9 months and then actually has to give birth. And I think especially in the world where today where a lot of women are trying to be more actively involved in their work, that her decision to have a child shouldn't influence her ability to be hired, her ability to be promoted, and her ability to be paid just as much as a male counterpart who maybe doesn't have to take time off. So if she wants to have a child, she should be able to have a child regardless of how this is going to affect her work experience, because that would be a form of discrimination against women. Great point.
Great point. Okay, final question. We've talked about some trends, some issues. Is there anything that alarms you or worries you about parenting or the trends in parenting right now? I wonder, one of my concerns, and you can build off of me here, is that are we overprotective? Are we essentially bubble wrapping our children? Are we allowing them to fail, to learn from mistakes?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that as being a concern. I think, obviously I don't have any kids, but from what I've seen of my siblings and me, which is basically my exposure in this area from my parents, but the ability to let your child learn in whatever way is best, I think is something that people today maybe are losing in their obsession with parenting, that they're trying to make sure they're getting everything right from their end, that they're not considering, well, what if my child, can do this better for themselves. So an example of this would be parents who maybe insist that their child gets a job, or maybe they insist that their child doesn't get a job and focuses on their schoolwork. Maybe this is something like their child learning to just do things like laundry and learning to make their own phone calls to employers if they're sick. That parents say, well, I don't want my child to lose out on opportunities because they messed up. so I'm going to do this for them. And that in turn can lead to kids who get away to university or who move out of the house for another reason, and they don't know how to do things like income tax. They don't know how to sort their colors when they're doing the laundry. They don't know how to dress professionally for an interview. They don't know how to talk professionally to their boss because it's something their parents have always done. I think this over-parenting is something that we're seeing a lot of now, where parents are super concerned with what they're doing, that what their child is doing isn't getting the attention it deserves, and their child isn't developing in these ways the way they should be. So I think that would be a concern that I would have.
Oh, that's a great point. And CBC has actually done a really interesting documentary on the helicopter parenting, and you can watch that online. Meagan, thank you so much for this opportunity to sit down and talk about parenting as part of your 4U HHS Families in Canada course. What's the future hold for Meagan Beattie?
Well, I know why you're asking. I've decided to go to Trent University in Oshawa this coming fall to study English. From there, I haven't decided officially yet, but I'm thinking of either doing law school or pursuing my PhD and being a professor. So we'll see. English is something that's always interested me, but psychology...
You speak it well.
Well, thank you.
Yes.
I've been working on it for about 18 years. But psychology is another one. So actually this class has been a really great opportunity for me to get that exposure to social sciences as well as psychology, so psychology being a social science, that may influence my decisions later on in my career of what path I'm going to pursue. So it's been a great time. Thank you for doing this interview with me.
Awesome. Big shout out to Meagan Beattie, parents Carol and Craig. Congratulations, Bronwyn and Joe, on your marriage. Shout out to Liam, Jack, and Catherine for dealing with Miss Beattie and her expertise and punctuality. Big thanks to Tyler Miller and Mitch Desolitz who do the intro music, and big thank you to our executive producer who does all the tech stuff for us, alumnus Zach Kubaseski. Thank you for joining us on this edition of Mr. Nowak's Classroom, the virtually irrelevant podcast.